Good morning, everyone. On behalf of UNESCO Kingston, I warmly welcome all distinguished participants to today's webinar to sustain educational opportunity in times of COVID-19. Ms. Catherine Grigsby, Director, UNESCO Kingston office, will open the seminar. But before we begin, as the new program specialist for education at UNESCO Kingston office, I'm delighted to introduce the keynote speaker and distinguished participants. We are delighted to have with us today Professor Fernando Reimers, Ford Foundation Professor of the Practice of International Education. Professor Reimers is an expert in the field of global education, and his research and teachings focus on understanding how to educate children and youth so that they can thrive in the 21st century. Professor Reimers will lead today's seminar in support of decision makers and education leaders at various levels of educational governance to develop and implement national education plans to respond to the pandemic. A very warm welcome, Professor Reimers, and thank you for your generosity with your time and knowledge. On a personal note, I'm so happy to welcome you, Professor Reimers. You were my thesis advisor for my doctoral research, and I'm so glad we can continue our collaboration and learn with you. I'm also very honored to introduce the distinguished panel of national and regional experts we have with us today. Her Excellency, Secretary General Dr. Alison Archer of the British Virgin Islands, the National Commission for UNESCO. So welcome and thank you for joining us. Could you wave to everybody? Dr. Alison, are you there?
Me, I'm here. Good morning, everyone.
Thank you. Yes, we have with us Dr. Carol Iris Babb, the Chief Education Officer from the Ministry of Education, Belize. Would you like to greet everyone?
Hi, good morning, everyone. It's good to see you, and I'm very excited about this discussion today. So I hope to learn a lot and to find out what everybody else is doing. Thank you.
And Dr. Knut Thompson, head of the Caribbean Center for Educational Planning at the University of West Indies.
Wave here.
Welcome and thank you.
Thank you too.
And Dr. Rebecca Tortello, who is the education specialist at UNICEF Jamaica.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for the opportunity to join.
Everybody.
Good morning.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So we now will begin with the opening remarks from Ms. Catherine Grigsby, Director, UNESCO Kingston Office. The floor is yours.
Thank you.
Director.
Thank you. Officials of Caribbean Ministries of Education, Professor Fernando Reimers, Ford Foundation Professor of the Practice of International Education at Harvard University, distinguished panelists, Secretary Generals of Caribbean National Commissions for UNESCO, international development partners, dear ladies and gentlemen, good morning. The COVID-19 pandemic has resulted in unprecedented educational disruption in Caribbean small island developing states. School closures have left 7 million learners and over 90,000 teachers across 23 countries and territories in the sub-region grappling with the new reality of distance learning. Discussing educational opportunities in this challenging context is more timely than ever. In this respect, it is my pleasure to welcome you today to the webinar, A Framework to Guide an Education Response to the COVID-19 Pandemic of 2020. Today, we have the honor to have Professor Fernando Reimers with us, Ford Foundation Professor of the Practice of International Education and Director of the Global Education Innovation Initiative at Harvard University. Professor Reimers is also a member of UNESCO's High-Level Commission for Education. In this respect, please join me in cordially welcoming him. We look very much forward to his keynote speech on the framework to guide an education response to the COVID-19 crisis of 2020. I should also like to extend a warm welcome to the distinguished panelists who are joining us for the ensuing discussion. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to take this opportunity to share with you that UNESCO, as lead United Nations agency for Sustainable Development Goal 4 on quality education, has convened a COVID education task force for the Caribbean, which has held its first meeting on 22nd April 2020. As a result, and upon the request of our member states, the UNESCO Cluster Office for the Caribbean is pleased to facilitate a series of webinars and consultations to support ministries of education to prepare for and mitigate the impact of the current COVID-19 crisis. Connecting research with policy and practice lies at the heart of UNESCO's global mandate and is a key principle of our work. Today, we are coming together to discuss education in this global emergency situation. Suspending classes has had an impact beyond education. In this respect, UNESCO plays an active role in supporting policymakers in formulating holistic solutions to address the complex challenges that arise. To name some examples, this crisis has provoked strong negative emotional responses such as panic, stress, anxiety, anger, and fear. In response, UNESCO puts at the disposal of the education community resources to include social and emotional learning as part of teacher professional development during confinement. School closures have also had a direct impact on the nutrition of many learners. It is estimated that globally, over 365 million primary school children are missing out on school meals. For poor households, the loss of school meals means a negative impact on income and food security. UNESCO partners with different actors to find solutions to this pressing challenge. Several countries are now starting to ease so-called lockdown and stay-at-home guidelines, also in the Caribbean. With a view to the future, UNESCO remains committed to assist member states in the reopening of schools. At the global level, UNESCO has facilitated a dialogue with ministers of education and has developed a framework for reopening schools to support governments as an important tool that would certainly also benefit Caribbean SIDS. Multi-stakeholder partnerships are the cornerstone for catering to the needs and challenges of our Caribbean member states. In this respect, I wish to invite you to join forces with UNESCO to facilitate inclusive learning opportunities for children and youth during this period of sudden and unprecedented educational disruption. Let me conclude by saying that in the midst of every crisis lies great opportunity. While COVID-19 has put enormous pressures on our educational systems in the Caribbean, this pandemic can be a unique opportunity to rethink educational policy and strengthen educational systems in a holistic way towards ensuring that we are on track on achieving SDG 4 in the Caribbean. In this spirit, we look forward to an interactive and informed dialogue today to address some of the pressing issues member states are now facing. I thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Director. Professor Reimers, the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Faryal and Catherine, for this invitation, and to all of you for the opportunity to have this conversation. Let me first say the obvious, that we are experiencing together a very tragic moment for humanity, a moment in which 3.8 million people have been infected by this virus, for which we don't yet have a cure, and more than 250,000 people have died. And those are the people who have been correctly diagnosed as having died from COVID. The number of actual deaths is probably much greater. The New York Times publishes today an analysis of the number of deaths per week in a number of states and compares them to the same number over the last 5 years. And the balance is attributed to be related to COVID, and that figure is 50% higher than the number of deaths that have been assigned to COVID. But what's even worse is that this is not over yet. Until we have a vaccine, for which the best estimates are that this is 12, 18 months ahead, we will have to live in some way adjusting to the reality and in hopes of making it alive to the other side. So, to paraphrase Winston Churchill, who in November of 1942, middle of World War II, said to the British people, I cannot say that this is the beginning of the end, but I can say that it is the end of the beginning. With respect to this pandemic, this is not even the end of the beginning. This is the beginning of the beginning. So this is a time of shared mourning and loss for humanity. But the loss and the mourning is not just over the lives that are being impacted. It's about all the other multiplier effects that this pandemic is going to have. The most obvious one is the impact that it is going to have on economies as states shut down businesses and as states absorb the financial costs of attending to the public health emergency. In the United States, open unemployment figures have skyrocketed from under 5% to close to 30%. Our food banks are at capacity because people need assistance to stay alive. Hunger is spreading not just throughout the United States, but throughout the world. And as we think about a post-pandemic world in which the way in which most governments will have to finance the economic cost of this pandemic through debt, we know that what is coming is a period of severe financial austerity and economic adjustment in public spending. So these are no ordinary times. This is the defining moment. And for education, it is perhaps a defining moment that could wipe away many of the gains made in educational opportunity in the last 50 years. What this pandemic is doing is augmenting every possible inequality in educational opportunity that results from the different social circumstances in which children live. The pandemic is also being mediated by the very different levels of institutional capacity and of leadership capacity of schools, school systems, and nations. So we can expect that a year from now, the world will be a lot more unequal educationally than it is today. And what we know about education is that it has lifelong consequences for individuals and for nations. There are teams as we speak at the World Bank calculating the impact that this pandemic will have in diminished prospects for economic recovery and growth of many states. It's not pretty. So it is fitting that we should meet together to try to figure out what can we do to mitigate the impact of this pandemic. What can we do that can protect the gains made in educational opportunity, and especially the learning loss that will be suffered by the most disadvantaged children. It was also in 1942, the same year when Winston Churchill spoke with great clarity and honesty to the British people, that a group of leaders met in London to begin to imagine what would it take to rebuild education systems after the world. And it was out of that meeting that UNESCO was born. It was at that meeting in 1942 that the idea of an international organization devoted to cooperation to advance education was born. So these are the times that we live. And I do think this is in many ways the ultimate adaptive challenge. In contrast to a technical challenge for which a solution is known, and what we need to do is execute with fidelity the way to get out of the challenge. In an adaptive challenge, the solution is not known. But we do know some things about how to create conditions that make it possible to invent the solution as we navigate the challenge. A lot of honesty, communication, transparency, and collaboration, and a lot of feedback loops is very helpful. There's been a lot of analysis of the different kinds of leadership around the world, political leadership, that have mediated how various countries have navigated the challenge. One of those analyses highlights the role of Angela Merkel and the prime ministers of New Zealand and Australia as being exceptionally competent, because these three women did not lie to the people. They spoke with great truth about what is happening and what is ahead. They stayed very close to the evidence and to the fact. They had no problem in taking risks and in acting swiftly with measures that were unpopular. In contrast, other political leaders have deceived their populations with respect to the gravity of the crisis, have stayed away from the evidence, and have been too slow to respond. We know also that in adaptive challenges, breaking down institutional silos, promoting communication and collaboration across institutions, level of government, public and private sector, is more likely to give us the opportunity to generate the solutions that we need than anything that is about protecting turf. So it is in that spirit that 6 weeks ago, when I began to understand from conversations with my colleagues in the health sciences, the implications that this challenge was going to have for education, that I asked myself, how can I be helpful? And I engaged my colleagues in the Global Education Innovation Initiative in trying to produce a series of simple tools that could assist education leaders in putting together a strategy. And so far, we have produced 2 documents. One is a document I'm going to talk about. It's a very simple thing. I reached out to the heads of 5 major development institutions where I have friends. And I said, we need to do something quickly because governments are in need of assistance. They need to make decisions tomorrow and they cannot wait 2 months. And the person who most quickly responded was Andreas Schleicher, the Director of Education, the Education Directorate in the OECD. And he will have my gratitude forever for his capacity to understand and assimilate the urgency of this crisis. And within a week, we had developed a survey and we had published the results within 2 weeks in what is called a framework to guide responses to the COVID pandemic. We also committed at that moment to repeat that exercise every month, because my expectation is that this crisis is not going to be over anytime soon. And my expectation is that 6 months from now, we will be living with some form of accommodation. And I think in that context, it is very helpful to continue to have rapid feedback loops that can tell us where are we and what needs are emerging and how are people addressing those needs as a way to feed that information back into a system that will need to continue to try to navigate in what is likely to be a very dark night ahead. So I will talk about that report, but that report is now dated. We collected the data for that report 6 weeks ago. In fact, we have been collecting over the last week data for a second report, which we hope to make public at the end of next week. And we will probably conduct a survey a month from now and 2 months from now and so on. In that report, we had also asked the respondents, 333 individuals from 100 different countries, what are you doing to create alternative means of delivery? Are you using learning packets? Are you using online instruction? Are you using radio? Are you using television? I'll get to the findings in a moment. The honest answer is that most governments were doing very little 6 weeks ago, that they had no strategy. And that if you slice the results by level of economic development of the country, the least developed countries were doing less, were caught completely with their pants down with respect to the crisis. Now, some of that may be because the impacts of the crisis were felt first in the Northern Hemisphere, but make no mistake, a virus knows no borders. It is coming and it will come to all over the world. And so we thought there was a short window of time that nations would have to put in place programs of education continuity where they might be able to learn something from the responses of those who had been hit first by the epidemic. Among the strategies of continuity, surprisingly, the area that had been most used was online learning. Surprisingly, because as we now realize, it is not the response that is going to reach most kids, because most kids do not have access to the devices, to the connectivity, or the skills to learn online. But in contrast, radio education and television education, at least 6 weeks ago, was not in a response that had been adopted by many. And what we did with that framework was to convene a series of informed dialogues, bringing together very large groups of people, I mean in the thousands, in many different countries, to provide an opportunity to get those constituents who included parents, teachers, principals, as well as ministers of education, to share their reflections to those findings and their insights about how this pandemic was impacting educational opportunity from their vantage point in the places they could see. And we also used those informed dialogues to capture what was happening and to basically together think about what could be done. And one of the ideas that was generated on those dialogues was, how about using an array of means of delivery that would include radio, that would include television, that would include textbooks and learning packets where that is possible. So all of that is now happened and is happening. But we also basically took all those resources that respondents had indicated they were using for online instruction, and we put together a team of 25 people to analyze them carefully and to present them in an organized framework, which I have also published, with the goal, fully understanding that this is not going to solve the issue of continuity for the reasons that I have mentioned. But if we can at least solve 20% of the problem that way, that will free up capacity so that those limited capacities of ministries can then concentrate in the children who cannot be served by online instruction. We are at the moment producing a series of very short case studies of examples of educational continuity in various jurisdictions. And we will begin to publish them next week. Our goal of the next 2 months is to publish 100 mini cases that basically highlight good practices around the world. How are people doing? And I'll be sharing some of them today. Our hope is that in this context, we might look at those that have managed to create some form of continuity, because that may inspire responses in other places. So that's what we're doing. As I mentioned, we're doing these in the context of the Global Education Innovation Initiative. Let me just say a word about the initiative so that it provides some context to understand why did we choose to do that. The Global Initiative was not created to help us figure out how to educate during a pandemic. I established it 7 years ago with a very clear mission to advance knowledge that can support, transform public education so that educational institutions provide students the opportunity to develop the capacities they need in the 21st century. It's a research action collaborative that basically is about understanding how it is that education leaders and practitioners define and practice teaching and learning that is relevant to the 21st century, so we can support public schools in empowering students to thrive. And we achieve our mission through 3 interrelated activities. We conduct applied research, we promote informed dialogues, and we develop simple tools that can help teachers figure out, what do I do differently on Monday morning? We have published 6 studies, the 3 last of which were published during this pandemic. And because of the conditions that we're in, we publish these as open education resources. They are completely free online. They can be downloaded freely. One of them is a comparative study of education reforms on the lower left-hand side, of education reforms that took place in 8 different countries that have the aim of transforming the curriculum so that students would develop the breadth of skills necessary to navigate an uncertain, volatile, and rapidly changing world. We think that those findings are particularly timely to the current moment, because as Catherine said a moment ago, one of the things we will have to do when we get to the other side, when we no longer fear for our lives, for losing our lives in the midst of this pandemic, would be to ask, what is it that schools should do in a context where we have just seen through this pandemic that the reason these gaps in opportunity developed is because most children did not have the capacity to learn independently, to learn autonomously, to function without a lot of hand-holding from their teachers. I will share with you on the chat room later an invitation to a 3-day seminar, free, open, we're hosting in a few weeks to discuss that book. The second book in the lower middle corner, also just released a few weeks ago, free available, is a comparative study of 6 programs, national programs of professional development of teachers that have the aim of building the capacities of teachers to educate the whole child. And the last book on the top right-hand side is a study of a topic that is very dear to the heart of UNESCO and of the UN system, because it is about goal 4.7, how do we educate global citizens? As an indication that in this pandemic, as many of us stay at home and fear for our lives, our brains do not stop function. I have been surprised to see how many people are reading. And even though these books were published a few weeks ago, the book Educating Students to Improve the World has been downloaded 86,000 times. It's not what one would expect in a pandemic, that people are making the time to read about what does it mean to educate global citizens. And the book on empowering teachers has been downloaded 77,000 times. Again, not one would expect in a pandemic that there are people asking themselves, how do we prepare teachers to educate the whole child? And the book examining the comparative education reforms, which was published just a week ago, has been downloaded 37,000 times. Again, not what one would expect at a moment when we're still counting the number of dead people. The people would be asking, how do we transform education systems? So these are unusual times. The second set of things that we do is to construct informed dialogues. And informed dialogue is based on a theory I developed with a former colleague, Noel McGinn, 20 years ago, recognizing that books are themselves, and that if one wants the ideas of books to actually enter a process of policy conversation, it's very important to architect, to engineer meetings in which people bring their questions and their knowledge, to make that knowledge part of a conversation in which ideas from research have a place. And we have published, in fact, all the tools that we are now producing fit into the category of these informed dialogues, and particularly these convenings that we're producing are about doing these informed dialogues. And lastly, we have produced a series of curriculum resources aligned with the UN SDGs, in particular with the UN SDGs and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights to educate global citizens. So that gives you some context for why are we producing these tools, because we think that this pandemic, even though we did not anticipate it, nor did we wish it, is central to our mission. If our mission is to help students become relevant to the needs of the present and the future, this pandemic is a real test about the honesty of our convictions. Are we really about responding to the urgencies and the needs of the present and the future? And that's why we have completely refocused all of our efforts around that. And on this link below, you can access the publications that I have mentioned and the case studies that we will be publishing and the results of that survey. So let me share with you some of the findings from that survey, with the caveat that those are all news, and then maybe I can give you some fresh news based on the case studies as I get to the end. So what we found 5 weeks ago is that most countries basically told the students and the teachers, don't come back to school. They were following the advice of the public health authorities. What I now see as governments are beginning to talk about reopening schools is not that they're following the advice of the public health authorities, is that there is tremendous pressure from those interested in reopening the economies and from political leaders who realize it's very difficult for people to stay much longer at home. But there is a growing conflict between the public health authorities and the political leaders who are under tremendous pressure to reopen those schools. So I don't know how this is going to play out. I think that a likely scenario is that the way this pandemic may play out, and I'm just paraphrasing our public health experts, will play out the way the pandemic that took place a century ago took place, which is that we saw an outbreak in the spring. As the summer came, things receded, and as we put in place physical distancing methods, we flattened that curve. And then as we go back to normal, we will see a second wave, perhaps worse than the first wave. So that's important to keep in mind in any kind of plans to reopen the schools. Any sense that we're going back to normal until we have a vaccine is not grounded on rational thinking and on analysis of the evidence that we have so far in terms of where we are in containing the spread of this virus. But to go back to our survey, even though most countries had shut down schools, only some countries had well-developed education strategies to sustain educational opportunity during the pandemic. And there were a number of exemplary practices, but for the most part, this pandemic caught most governments with their pants down educationally. Essentially, they were unprepared and they had no plan. And many school districts in the United States, including some here in Massachusetts, had to make plans over a weekend to basically send everybody home. Harvard University, which is in many respects a well-endowed and organized university, we took a week to basically shift all of our instruction online. And we had a lot of support. We had a lot of resources, I suppose. It was better than other universities. My wife is a professor in another university. They had a weekend to make that shift. So hardly the way one would transition a system from functioning in a residential mode to functioning in a virtual mode. But everybody did the best they can. We did it in great spirits. We understood that we had to roll up our sleeves and try to be helpful. And our students were very forgiving. I still cannot tell you what we're going to do next semester. I'm hoping we will make a decision very soon because time is of the essence. The worst thing with respect to a situation like that is to make decisions at the last minute and without a strategy. What a strategy allows an education system or a school to do is to decide what's really important. So for example, in these various informed dialogues in which we have been discussing this report, I found that the nations that actually, or the jurisdictions that had taken the time to ask what's really important, had been able to put in place strategies that were sensible. Let me give you an example. The state of Sao Paulo in Brazil, on which I have been writing a case with a colleague, the Secretary of Education, a very capable woman who had been the Secretary of the state of Amazonas, a fairly underdeveloped region of Brazil, where she had gained a lot of experience, not only in teaching in conditions of great adversity, but in using online instruction. She was able to put together a team in her cabinet that said, what's really important? And they said, the first thing that's really important is the well-being of our students. And we know that many of our students eat in the school. And we have to make sure that not only do they continue to eat, but their families eat. And she built a partnership with the private sector, with many very large businesses in Sao Paulo, which contributed financial resources to create a means of alternative delivery of food, not just to children, but to their families. The second thing she was able to do is she said, we need to create a delivery chain of education now that kids can come to school. And they created a media center in a period of 2 weeks, a media center that began to develop partnerships with local television or radio stations so that there is set time during the day to deliver a curriculum. They also created a mechanism to be in touch with the kids through mobile phones, to check in with them. How are you doing? So that's a very good example of what having a strategy for continuity, which begins with asking what's truly important, does. In contrast, there are authorities, educational authorities in other countries in which we have held these informed dialogues, where the ministry had thought what's really important is to continue keeping pace with the curriculum, not asking the question of what's really important. So what they have been doing is pushing messages to family that are about covering the curriculum, not realizing that in one country in particular, there are well-documented problems with domestic violence in this country. Predictably, under the conditions of stress created by the fact that many of those vulnerable families have lost their source of income, those stressors can aggravate the conditions that lead to violence in the home, particularly against women and children. So in that context, not having a strategy and believing that the most important, the most helpful thing to do is to put pressure on the family so they can continue covering and keeping pace with the curriculum is a way not only not to be helpful, but to cause harm. So I hope those two cases, those contrasting cases, underscore how important it is in a time of crisis of the severity that we're experiencing to take the time and to build a process to define what's truly important and to look for ways to actually act in accordance to that, to align actions behind the sense of priorities. We found in the survey that for the most part around the world, ministries have essentially told the schools, you figure it out, without providing much support or guidance on how to do it. So it is no wonder that at the moment, we see these differences caused by the various levels of capacity and leadership of districts playing out. They are playing out because the states relinquished their role to act as a mediator, to act as an equalizer. If anyone ever wanted to know what difference schools make in a society, this is as close as I hope we'll ever have to get to being able to answer the question. We forget sometimes that public schools were invented maybe 2 centuries ago and why they were invented. They were invented to level the playing field for kids who were born in different circumstances. And over the years that we have grown accustomed to those institutions, debates that are sometimes too academic ask the question, do schools really matter? Not realizing, I've heard absurdities like, why don't we just give every kid a laptop? They'll teach themselves what they need. I've heard the proposition, if we just put schools and computers in public places, kids will figure out what they need to learn and how. Of course, the only way to answer that absurd question, what difference do schools make, would be to shut down the schools. Well, this pandemic hasn't completely shut down the schools, but has made it very difficult to schools to operate at full levels of capacity. And what we see is not pretty. And what we'll see coming out of that will be even worse, because what is happening is tremendous learning loss and tremendous increase in the gaps of skills among kids in different circumstances. And those gaps will have consequences for children and for nations for decades to come. There are 2 very well-established facts established by research which are absolutely fitting to the current circumstances. One is the research on learning loss. We have known for the last 5 decades that during the summertime, students not only fail to learn because most of them, as schools follow this agrarian calendar, are not engaged academically, they forget what they lost. And that learning loss is much greater for children who come from disadvantaged backgrounds. We know that on average in the United States, during the summer months, children forget the equivalent of 1/10 of what they learn in the academic year. So a pandemic that is going to, at the end, sum up to the equivalent of 2 summers, the pandemic from the summer is going to produce a 20% on average learning loss in the US. But it's likely to be more because, as I said, I don't expect this issue to be resolved as schools reopen next year. I think they will reopen just to close again or to function at very limited levels of capacity. The second area of research, which is very relevant to the current time, is the research on toxic stress. We have known for some time that when children, indeed anybody, experiences stress, chronic stress for extended periods, that bathes the brain on cortisol, which impedes normal cognitive functioning. And it tends to eventually lead to learning difficulties, to problems with attention, and so on. So we can be sure that this pandemic is placing many children under conditions of chronic stress. that have not yet finished. And so that suggests to me that in defining priorities for education systems during a strategy of continuity, one of the most important things would be to address the emotional well-being and the social well-being of children and their families, a task that has always been important, but is especially important under the current circumstances. A task, by the way, at which schools haven't been very good because we haven't really prioritized building the capacity to do that. So let me go to some of the findings in this survey. So when these 333 respondents that we surveyed 6 weeks ago, when we asked them what are the most important needs, I have presented these needs ranked by order of importance. Of course, ensuring the continuity of academic learning was at the very top. Providing professional support to teachers to teach into these circumstances was second. Ensuring the well-being of teachers, supporting students who lack the skills for independent study during the crisis, ensuring the well-being of their students. You can see what we had there. We then asked which of these priorities are the most challenging. Ensuring the continuity of academic learning was at the top. And I guess those who anticipated those priorities knew what they were talking about, because that remains a problem. We now know that it has not been possible to ensure the continuity of academic learning for all students, but especially for the students who have the least support in the homes, whose living conditions are less suitable to have any kind of semblance of normalcy in engaging in academic activities. We asked the respondents to identify what areas pose the greatest implementation challenges. And at the top, of course, remains ensuring academic learning, availability of technological infrastructure, and finding ways to provide support to teachers and advice so they could teach under these circumstances. One of the things that we published in that report was a checklist that contains these 25 recommendations, which we're happy have really made it into the conversation. They are now, they become a new normal. We basically, if there was one message of that report, was some plan is better than no plan. And to have a plan, you need to put a team in place. You need to think about a communication process. You need to define key strategic principles like the well-being of children. It's very important to coordinate with public health authorities. And I believe this is going to be especially important going forward, because I anticipate there will be growing conflict between responding to the demands of the public and of business and responding to the advice of the public health authorities. And I believe that the education system should not be in the business of endangering the health and the lives of children. There is evidence that is just beginning to emerge that suggests that the early indications that children were immune to this virus are not true. And so it's going to be very important to have continued coordination with the public health authorities. And it might mean very difficult conversations and negotiations with political authorities. We're prioritizing the curriculum goals. Let's face it, the capacity to deliver education is diminished. And that means that during the exigency, during the period when we cannot go back to school at their levels of functioning, we're going to have to adjust our goals. And we also have to be prepared to recover a lot of lost learning time once we can resume normal functioning. That is going to require a lot of flexibility, a lot of willingness on the part of everyone to roll up our sleeves and to ask, how can I be helpful? This is not a time to be hanging on into the notion of protecting turf or privileges. At a local university, the president had a meeting with all the faculty 2 days ago. And he announced a massive deficit that the university was facing. And he said, we're trying to develop a way to continue our mission next year. And that's going to require a lot of time from people in the summer. Time that many faculty are accustomed to using to write their research on their books. So one of the faculty members told that president, who's going to compensate us for this time? He said, have you listened to what I just said? Have you heard me talk about a deficit that could cause us to have to fire a third of the people in this institution? No one is going to compensate you for this. You're going to have to do it to save your institution. And this is the time in which we're living. I'm really hoping that every institution, that teachers, that parents, that teacher unions, that international cooperation agencies understand that this is the moment that we live. This is our 1942 moment. And I hope that we're up to the times. So with that, let me stop here. Faryal, you're on mute. You need to unmute yourself.
Thank you so much. You've shared some very sobering facts, and also the recommendations that you've shared have been, I think, they're going to be very useful at country level to start, developing the response. We would like to open the floor with the panelists, and I would like to invite Dr. Carol Babb to share her thoughts to Fernando's presentation. Dr. Carol Babb, the floor is yours.
Okay, good morning, everyone. I would just like to share some information to give you an idea of what is happening in Belize before I respond to some of Dr. Fernando's questions and his address. When I share what we are doing in Belize, Dr. Fernando has mentioned a number of things that we are doing, and I am so happy that we are almost doing everything, not quite, but we are doing quite a lot. So in Belize, just to give you some context, we have 629 schools that are closed, 106,357 students are out of school, 6,241 teachers are not in classrooms as they normally do because you are aware that schools are closed. What are we doing to continue education in Belize? As Dr. Fernando mentioned, we are doing daily online lessons using radio and in some cases television. We have also uploaded the lessons on the ministry website. We call our lessons Education on the Move. We have radio lessons Monday to Thursday. And we actually provide hard copies for especially, you mentioned that we must ensure that we are preparing for the marginalized and for those who are at risk. So we have explored
I think we just lost your connection. I hope you can hear us. I don't hear Carol Babb. Do the rest of you hear her?
No, we don't.
Peter,
Carol?
can you help Peter?
No, she'll have to reestablish.
All right.
Perhaps we will move to Dr. Alison Flax Archer, the Secretary General of the British Virgin Islands from the National Commission of UNESCO. Dr. Flax Archer, you've presented several training sessions for the government of the Virgin Islands, and you were also selected as a future leader within the public service of the Virgin Islands. Would you like to share your reactions to the thought-provoking presentation by Professor Reimers?
Yes, absolutely. First, let me say good morning, Director Grigsby, Professor Reimers, colleagues, and viewing audience. I'd just like to say thank you to the UNESCO Cluster Office for the Caribbean for inviting me to take part in this webinar. I believe it's extremely important given the climate, not just in the Caribbean and other small island developing states, but also for the world. Regarding the British Virgin Islands, our government has opened as of this past Monday for services. The schools remain closed, which is a challenge, but the students have been working through some form of distance learning. It is extremely difficult for those that are marginalized. Internet access is an issue, as you can imagine, as well as the number of devices for work in homes where there are multiple students. And the list, of course, goes on. It's a difficult period. And Professor Reimers, the framework that you have provided, your presentation, and you're extremely passionate, which you're extremely passionate about, is definitely a guide to this response. It certainly is a way forward. And I'd like to commend you and your colleague that has been working with you on this presentation, which highlights what the next steps could possibly look like for educations after things become normal again. Or is this actually the new normal? I believe that in your presentation, you indicated that we're looking at least 18 months, a year to 18 months. So this is the new normal. So getting to the framework, as I know I don't have much time, my thought is that while many educators and senior officers within government have seen that distance learning, and for those of you that were on the webinar yesterday on supporting teachers and education personnel to ensure continuity of learning during this period, and that was hosted by the Cluster Office for the Caribbean and CARICOM, we are aware of the several means of learning through distance. So we don't need to address them, as they and other care for and learning methods are listed in Professor Reimers' framework. But as the only option for young people to continue learning during this period, and for some it's not even an option, because as Dr. Reimers mentioned, we weren't ready for this, and we still aren't ready for this, but we are trying our best, but many are going to get left behind. Many are going to get left behind for various reasons, especially the marginalized, even though we are trying to accommodate. I believe that this framework that has been presented as well researched with points that will remain successful outcomes if utilized. But I also acknowledge that as a result of infrastructures within each country, some points may need to be. I look at this framework also as being the rebirth of education. And whether we like it or not, I'm of the opinion that we must find a way to put education first so that this rebirth can take place, or our kids, our young people, our even adults will become more left behind. So that brings to the forefront that SDG, the Sustainable Development Goal number 4, which actually might need to be modified in light of the COVID-19. I think that given time, I'm only able to touch on two of the items on that checklist. And I just like to focus on number 6. And Dr. Reimers, you shortened it from the presentation, the link that was sent, but it was learning recovery. I'm looking at number 6, learning recovery after physical distancing. And the entire context read, identify the feasibility of pursuing options to recover learning time once social distancing period is over, for example, an intensive review period during the break prior to the start of the new academic year. So this is the one that I thought was going to be extremely difficult, because I believe that students are still going to be left behind regardless. I think for all concerned that this scenario is going to be looked at as punishment, especially for the younger students if they're doing an intense review, because when does that intense review take place? And then I think that what we need to do, or what we can consider doing, is maybe making the vacation times shorter and possibly put things within that week or 2, well, it would be more than, over the period of the next year, because this involves quite a number of persons. It involves the teachers, students, it involves parents, it involves a number of persons. Actually, it involves the entire community. the one that I really loved from the checklist of 25 was number 16, which you entitled Revised Regulatory Framework. And the entire context for those that are listening, it says, as needed, revise regulatory framework in ways that make online education and other modalities feasible, and in ways that support teacher autonomy and collaboration. This includes providing school day credit for days taught in alternative education plans. I love this. I think that this particular point right here would work. And I'm not sure who the task force would be, which was listed in number 1, but I really feel that that task force would be a part of the revision of that regulatory framework. And I believe that CARICOM is in this meeting as well, should be a major part of that so that it can be implemented. My final statement is to just add that moving forward, there are research-based decisions that education systems and schools can and should be making now in relation to technology-enabled learning, which are mentioned but differently within the framework, and will build resilience and sustainability in learning well into the future. And I'll just give the 3 that I came up with. We can think about these decisions in 3 phases. The immediate response phase, which will address the continuity of learning and teaching. And these 3 are just ones that I have pulled from the checklist that Dr. Reimers came up with. Number 2, interim capacity building phase, which focuses on moving to online learning and teaching. And just to elaborate for 2 seconds on this one, because if something like this were to happen again, we have hurricanes, we have, especially for small island developing states, we have all types of disasters that we are susceptible to. This right here is just the stepping stone to the future. Learning and teaching remotely so that we're not missing out. And finally, the 3rd, sustainability phase, which should concentrate on flexible learning and teaching options which are embedded in practice. So I believe that I should end my thoughts here because my 5 minutes might be up. I look forward to seeing how this framework will help the region. And thank you very much, Dr. Reimers, for your presentation. Very passionate, loved it, and I look forward to seeing what's going to happen next. Thank you.
Okay, hi, good morning. I am back. I apologize. I lost electricity and then I lost internet connectivity. So I don't know if I should continue or should I wait, or what do you want me to do?
Please do continue. Since you're online now, I would please conclude your remarks.
I was sharing what we are doing at the secondary and TVET level.
In Belize.
In Belize.
Yes.
So, okay, so we have developed continuity plans. We are distributing a newsprint called the Learner's Link with content and activities for students in the participating school. In terms of teacher continuing professional development, we are offering online CPD courses. We are offering 2 6-week courses that are currently underway. And it's called Striving in Uncertain Times, making sure your well-being is a priority. And we're also offering digital literacy to teachers, as many of our teachers are not as savvy as we would want them to be. What are the opportunities? I think it was Dr. Fernando, or I think the lady from UNESCO, who said earlier that in any crisis, there are opportunities. And one of the opportunities that we have learned that we need to build capacity for distance learning and teaching. We need to refocus the curriculum and also reevaluate the role of assessment. What are our challenges during this time? Limited students' access to technology, to devices, and to internet connectivity. Low parent education levels, planning with uncertainty. So during this time, a lot is dependent on parents to support their students, to support their children. And so, unfortunately, not many of our parents are able to do that. So I think what we will need to do going forward is also to train parents, to help parents. I was thinking that we may have to do tutorials to help parents how to support their students in this unprecedented time. So in Belize, the measures, the COVID-19 pandemic measures have been relaxed. We only had 18 confirmed cases. For the last three to 4 weeks, we have not had any confirmed cases. And so most businesses are opening, the airports are closed, but and all schools are closed. So we are still we are being very cautious to observe social distancing and wearing masks. And so that is in a nutshell what we are doing in Belize. So if you have any other questions, I'm here. I'm enjoying the discussion. I'm willing to answer questions.
Ariel, you mute yourself.
Hello, am I unmute? Do you hear me?
Yes, we're hearing you.
Very good. So, Dr. Carroll, as the Chief Education Officer, I mean, your work entails formulating responses and strategies. And at this time, we see in Belize, you've got diversified, approaches to address the situation. So that was very useful for us to learn that. We have now with us Dr. Knut Thompson, the Senior Lecturer in Educational Policy, Planning and Leadership, and Head of the Caribbean Center for Educational Planning at the University of West Indies, the Mona campus. So you're also the co-founder of the Caribbean Leadership Reimagination Initiative and the author of several books. So Dr. Thompson, we look forward to hearing your reactions to Professor Reimers' presentation and approach.
Thanks much, Madam Chair, and good morning, colleagues. Good morning, Professor Reimer. Thank you for a very insightful presentation. I know I have only 5 minutes, so I'll attempt to condense my thoughts as best as I could. The first thing that struck me from your presentation was the observation you made that we have an adaptive reality. We face an adaptive challenge, not a technical one. And therefore, our response will have to be iterative. We have to learn as we go. But one of the foundations, or perhaps one of the pillars on which that learning will have to take place, your observation in the preliminary comments you made to your presentation, was being faithful to the evidence, staying close to the evidence. And you commented on 3 of the countries which have been doing very well, coincidentally headed by women, New Zealand, Germany, among them. The explanation for the comparative success of these countries is their reliance on and respect for the evidence. And so the adaptation, it seems to me, and the successful adaptation must be located in taking account of the evidence. One of the mistakes some countries have made is to seek to manufacture alternative realities, alternative facts, and then to seek to base their actions on those alternative facts, realities, or falsehoods. And the consequences have been profound before our eyes. So what it really means for the education system, what it really means for planning, is that in seeking to reframe and refashion the world to make our education systems more resilient, we have to be mindful of what the evidence is showing. Another piece of evidence that you highlight is that contrary to our earlier understanding or assumptions, that children were relatively immune from this virus, or it is less likely to affect children. The fact that this is now proving not to be so requires that in our planning for our education systems, we be mindful of that reality. And so there are 3 pieces in your presentation that I found, in your central presentation, that I found instructive. The first had to do with informed dialogue, which then goes back to the question of how we treat with and engage evidence. And I believe that the education systems that are going to be successful in adapting to this reality are those that create opportunities for informed dialogue among stakeholders. One of the things that the Caribbean Center for Educational Planning is currently doing, we are, I would perhaps say, late to the game in this regard. We have a webinar planned for the latter part of June, in which we're going to be seeking to create a space for educational stakeholders to come together for the practitioners to share what their experiences have been. We know that some have been doing well, some have been struggling, but to share practice experience and to seek to build on the successes of others, or to take lessons from the successes of others. But also we're using that space to invite policyholders to confront, to take account of the reality. One of the fears we have is that because of the perhaps natural propensity of some leaders to create a picture that is different than the real thing, conversations around what is happening are sometimes adrift from the reality. So by bringing policymakers into the space with the practitioners, we create the opportunity for policy, Madam Chair, to be informed, and we're talking about adaptive policy as well as strategic policy, to be informed by what is taking place on the ground. The second piece in your presentation that I found instructive had to do with your finding that the publications that you have done have had thousands, tens of thousands of downloads in a short space of time, which confirm that despite the seeming or the presumed preoccupation that we believe people have with survival, many people are taking the time to read. And what that opens up, it seems to me, is the opportunity for us to use the adjusted school process and pace to fill the space with material to inform thinking, to inform planning, to inform conversation. And that finding connects back to the whole issue of the value of informed dialogue and the adaptive challenge. And final thing I think this your presentation highlighted is how we treat with the role of the family and the dangers in placing too much pressure on the family to pick up the slack for the education system. And I think what it does is it highlights the need for us to look at how we deploy college and university graduates to support families going forward. It seems to me that in countries where we have large numbers of unemployed university and college graduates, there is a role now to create a new form of schooling where the family is given support by persons who do not work in the large schools, which is the 200-year-ago response that we had made to deprived children. We now have the opportunity to provide greater support for families using trained people. I know my time is up, Madam Chair. I have a couple of thoughts, but I'm going to pause there.
Thank you so much. We will have an opportunity to continue, but thank you so much for sharing your insights. And we have with us now Dr. Rebecca Tortello. For the last 5 years, she has served as the education specialist at UNICEF Jamaica. And Dr. Tortello has regularly lectured at the University of West Indies in the Department of Education and is the author of a number of articles on education. So we look forward to hearing your reactions, Dr. Tortello. And after this, we will open up the floor for discussion. So are you with us?
Yes, I am. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. And thank you to my colleagues from UNESCO for the opportunity to participate and to continue learning, and to Professor Reimers for his informed presentation and all the resources he has shared, which I'm looking forward to going through when I have time and sharing with my colleagues in UNICEF globally and in our office in Jamaica and the ministry. So Jamaica is doing much similar to what you have said. We have been trying to support our close to 700,000 students, and that covers about 3,000 schools on the island if you take into account our early childhood system. We know from data that we've been gathering that we've been reaching 50 to 70% of those children using mixed on and offline provision with ongoing teacher and student support, parent support, teachers. What has emerged in this crisis is the strength of the use of WhatsApp. WhatsApp is being used for all kinds of things that I don't know that WhatsApp was originally intended to be used to do. And teachers are being very creative with and principals with their use of that tool. Also, where the ministry is printing and distributing materials. In some cases, principals are themselves using bikes to distribute these materials to their students. They are busily hard at work trying to curate existing content and securing public-private partnerships for the provision of that, the sharing of that content on community TV and radio and national TV and radio. The ministry and UNICEF and all of our partners are acutely aware that there's 30% that we're not reaching. We're acutely aware a large percentage of those are children with disabilities. We're acutely aware that parents need support. We've supported the creation of a helpline for parents. We're aware of potential rises in domestic violence, domestic abuse. Jamaica doesn't have a very good track record on corporal punishment to begin with. So, you know, we are doing the best we can. We did move very quickly, and now we're in a stage where we're trying to gather data to make more data-driven decisions. We are mindful that we have been able to continue school feeding programs for families using the government's partnerships with the private sector and the government's existing, what we call the PATH program. We're also very aware that the data that we have, when it tells us that we're reaching the students, it could mean that we're reaching them one day. It could mean that we're reaching them 3 days. It could mean that we're reaching them 5 days, and how many hours a day. We don't have the ability to disaggregate that data. We are, again, acutely aware that in some families, there's one device. Some schools have been lending devices, lending hardware that were in their computer labs to primarily targeting students who are to sit assessments, CSEC regional assessments to begin with. And to teachers, master teachers are giving of their time without any remuneration to stage ongoing teacher training on using new distance learning modalities. And we have been, as my colleagues have said, we've been catapulted in a way into the future in terms of how are we going to use this online provision and how are we going to maintain this online provision when we go back to whatever the new normal will look like, where we might have teams of students going 1 week and staying home another week in order to maintain the social distance in teaching outside. I don't know. What I do know is that the framework has been very well received. It provides an overarching, helpful macro structure to consider this a systemic response. And now that we are in this phase of what can we do, we have very much been working with trying to continue the curriculum as best as possible, meaning using that as a guide. Wherever you were, master teachers have come up with plans. Some schools are running on their own, but the ministry is providing overarching direction. We can do better with increased communication. So the communication plan in the checklist really jumped out at me. Numbers 5 and 6 also really jumped out at me. I think we're in that phase now where we're trying to determine what can we do? What do we want to gain from this next 6 weeks, 8 weeks we have? We know for sure, based on a notification from our Prime Minister this Monday, that our schools will reopen or are set to reopen on September 7th. So we are acutely aware that the economy might be opening in different phases. The airport is closed, essential services are functioning, and a few others like the construction industry. Masks are mandatory. But how is the economy going to open if students are at home is a little unclear. What are we going to do to prevent this COVID slide being exacerbated by the summer slide, which we know is going to come? How can we help families to create an important place of study for their children? I'm mindful in the discussion in the report that it recognizes technology as a main provider, but not the only provider, because it's only as good as its use. So how can we build the resilience of our students? And one of the things that we're realizing too is that in this last term of our school year, for many schools, after school provision has been cut. So if there's no after school provision, which was a time for children to have the capacity develop resilience and leadership skills and meet with their friends, and a chance for school students whose parents cannot afford for after-school provision to access these kinds of opportunities. What are we going to do about that? So we would be interested in more information on that. I'm looking forward to the case studies because I think the framework gives us an idea of what some countries are doing, but not necessarily the deeper dives into how they were able to strategically reach the status that they're now in. So from UNICEF's perspective, we are working with school leaders to develop an online leadership course for that will be a mandatory course for our principals and our senior directors. And we would also be grateful, Professor, for an idea of guiding questions that might help us think through this process of how are we going to continue the curriculum, or how can we just maintain the connectivity between the teachers and the students, because that's also an important factor and stable factor in many students' lives. So we want to be able, and how can we monitor it? So we're exploring a global UNICEF Microsoft tool called the Learning Platform, which you can find out more about if you go to the Learning Passport.org. Learning Passport is a platform that would enable ministries or governments to be able to monitor provision, to augment their existing curriculum, and importantly, provide records of student work or student contributions over this time, so that when we do go back to school, however we organize that into shorter terms, including catch-up phases, we have this record of what was going on that can be assessed. Assessment is another big challenge for us in the region. So regionally, educational content could be useful across islands, and it would be great to be able to share that rather than having to create individually for each island. The CSEC exams are regional, so how can we better work together? What are we going to do with our CSEC exams is a big question for us. And so I think that I'm very happy that you're going to be doing the surveys on an ongoing basis. I think that will be very useful for us because we always learn from what other countries are doing, and it helps us to narrow down, to think more strategically and more realistically. So I'm probably out of time, so I'm going to stop, but we're open to continued learning and partnership. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tortello. This has been really insightful to hear what is happening in Jamaica in particular, but also to hear about the learning platform, which is going to be very, very relevant, and a promising practice perhaps we can learn from. So thank you to all panelists for your experiential knowledge and for your sharing what is happening in your specific context, but also your close scrutiny of the proposed framework to assess the practical application within the Caribbean context. So Professor Reimers, the floor is yours to lead the discussion, and we have a lot of questions coming in from the question and answers from the participants, and the floor is yours to respond. Thank you.
So let me just say a few words in response to what I've heard, and then ask you as the moderator that maybe you can pick up a few questions and you address them to all of us on the panel, because I don't have the time to read the questions while I was listening. So if someone could do that, it would be useful. But let me just highlight 3 themes that have been mentioned, which I think are very important. I mean, first of all, I find that this conversation itself is an example of the value of making the time to listen across institutions to get a fuller picture of what is happening. And if you extend that concept to the idea of informed dialogue, that is exactly what I've tried to do, convening these meetings, to refer to Professor Thompson's comment of what he's planning to do with the university. At one of these meetings with 3,000 participants, in which in the same meeting I had the minister, and I had people telling him on the chat, but we have these problems of abuse in the home, and he read it and he said, this is very interesting. It's relatively simple to structure a process using a platform like this, in which you ask questions of the participants. And if you have enough of them, and if they're a varied group, you can capture that knowledge. You can, in a short period, have a mechanism to capture and distribute collective intelligence that would be good. It's essentially using modern tools to propose a different kind of government that makes it possible to have more participation from a range of stakeholders. And I think universities have a very important role to play in this crisis. I was yesterday at a meeting of this sort convened by the University of Guadalajara in Mexico, and they have taken on the responsibility of educating the larger public about the many different aspects of this pandemic, not just the education, public health, and so on. And I suggested to them, there are 3,500 universities in Mexico. If only 100 of them decided to collaborate in supporting elementary and secondary schools, in putting in place a strategy of continuity, that would make a big difference. Really, that capacity of the universities is greater than the capacity that the ministries of education have in many places. If we're going to face this challenge with the truth, and with humility, it is very important that we are not afraid to say things that are known but are difficult to do because they can offend some sensitivity. So I realize that it may be offensive to suggest that 100 universities together could do a lot more to support schools in developing a strategy for continuity, to curate educational resources, to prepare teachers, to support parents than a ministry. But in my experience, I believe that to be true in most countries, including in the United States. And I suspect it's also true in the Caribbean, but I don't know the Caribbean as well, so maybe I'm wrong. So I do commend you on the desire to mobilize the university on this behalf, because the truth, this is not a moment where we should be expecting anyone to tell us how to solve the problem. There is no one but us. There is no one but us. And yes, governments may want to say, we have this under control, we know what's happening, but any government that says that is not speaking with the truth. I think a government that is more honest would say, this is a time when we can't spare anyone. And if you're willing to help, why don't you come and let's try to have a help that is organized. So that for informed dialogue. Rebecca talked about the importance of global public goods. You said there is no reason why every island should be solving these problems together. I completely agree. I think this is a time when we need solutions at some scale. And let me give you an example. 6 weeks ago, when we began these discussions around this report, and it was clear people were not talking about television. And I brought up the suggestion, they said, but that's difficult to organize. Well, it doesn't have to be difficult. For example, for the Spanish-speaking world, if you look at a country like Mexico, Mexico has 4 decades of experience producing education TV, 8 satellite signals. There is enough programming there to address the education needs of every country in the Spanish-speaking world. And you know what the only 2 barriers are? One, politics. Governments sometimes don't like that their kids learn math with the accent of another country. But, those politics, I'm not sure they're acceptable in any circumstance. When the ship is sinking and you're trying to save minds, they're really, really not helpful. So that's one barrier. And the other barrier is business interests, right? The opposition to building free global public goods is often from those groups that are interested in making a quick buck by presenting a solution that they can sell. But a sinking ship is not the time for anyone trying to profiteer from the crisis. So that's why I think universities can be very helpful, not only in taking responsibility to strengthen schools, but also in advocating for the idea of global public goods, because you're already perceived in the Caribbean as a global public institution, at least a regional institution. So you can advance this notion that, maybe there is a good math curriculum that can be aligned to, I don't mean curriculum, I mean lessons that you can deliver on TV or radio or through various means. And the last thing I wanted to suggest is the following. I think it's going to become very important to help people have hope. As we count the dead, as we begin to internalize the cost of this pandemic and the world that awaits us, it's going to be important to give people hope. But I think we should resist the temptation of building hope on the basis of a false representation of reality. on the basis of lying to people, on the basis of telling people everything is going to be all right. Because in the end, it will be clear that not everything was all right. Instead, I think we should be hope on the basis of looking for goodness where we can find it and spreading that goodness, recognizing that goodness. There are people doing good things under difficult circumstances. Let's make an effort to find them, and let's document that, and let's build hope on that basis. And I think, again, universities and international development institutions could play a very useful role if they approach the task with humility, and if they said, let me begin with the assumption that I don't know what the right response is, but maybe there are people who have already figured it out. Let me find them, and let me document that and give them a platform. I will give you an example of some of these case studies that we're writing. One of the case studies is a case study of 2 teachers in Chile. They're part of an organization called Teach for Chile, similar to Teach for America. It's a network of like-minded organizations in 55 different countries. One of the things that a global network provides you, as Rebecca mentioned, is the opportunity to very quickly see what's happening elsewhere, to see the world as a global observatory, and to rapidly transfer ideas from one place to the next. So these 2 teachers saw that 2 teachers in Nigeria had begun to produce their own podcasts as a way to teach math and language. And they thought, wow, that's really cool. We should do the same thing. So this is 2 teachers, 25-year-old people. They began to develop these lessons. They were humorous, they were fresh, and they were a big success. Within a week, they had spread not only to their students, but to the entire district. So the head of the network then presented this idea to the Association of Mayors in the country. And they said, wow, we don't need to reinvent the wheel. Let's do this for everybody. They engaged the National Association of Radio Stations. So a month later, there are 240 radio stations in Chile, broadcasting lessons produced by 50 Teach for Chile graduates. To me, that's an example of the kind of goodness that is happening and that we need to recognize so that we inspire hope. Now, in normal times, this is what happens in some context. Someone sees that good practice and they ask, is that cutting into my turf? Should I support it or should I cut their legs? And if you conclude that that's getting, suppose you are, I don't know, the National Radio Education Station, and you conclude, how am I going to be put to shame by these 2 25-year-olds? I need to undercut them. And you undercut them in a variety of ways, right? You basically say, oh, this Teach for Chile is a neoliberal idea that is really undermining the teaching profession. And you begin to build a narrative that hurts them. Or you hurt them in other ways, like someone who got into your meetings yesterday, a heckler, and tried to disrupt it, bombing your meeting. I mean, it's a tragedy that at a time when people are dying, there would be individuals who would still be operating out of that mindset. And so I'm hoping that what universities and international development institutions can do is shift gears a little bit and say, this is the time to recognize goodness, no matter who's doing it, and to spread that as a way to inspire hope. It's a lot better than the alternatives, which are to lie to the people and which are to pretend that we know what we don't. I do want to conclude sharing one risk. You know, one piece of me thinks that this pandemic is a time for cultivation of a lot of global citizenship, because we're all in this together. We all know that any of us could die, and we're perhaps developing deep empathy with every other human. So that's the optimist scenario, that maybe we will come out of these with greater solidarity, with greater generosity, understanding that we're either going to come out of this together or not. But to go back to the evidence doesn't always show that events like these make people more generous. There is a report that was just published this week out of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York that shows that in the pandemic of the early 20th century in Germany came the rise of Nazism. And the way that happened is not because people said, oh, the people who caused the pandemic are, Jewish, but it's because the pandemic constrained the ability of local municipal authorities to fund social services and really had a big economic impact. And that caused a lot of hardship. And that hardship caused a lot of people to become more inward looking. It happens sometimes in times of hardship. When the pie gets smaller, we all become more tribal. And so that made a lot of people move to the right. And it explained the rise of the Nazi Party and eventually the breakdown of German democracy. So the reason to bring that up is not to suggest that this is inevitable, only to say that anything could happen. When I say that we don't know how this pandemic is going to play out, that's what I mean. But I do think that how we make sense of these events is going to be mediated by what any of us in a leadership position do to help people make sense of these events, make meaning. We could have good leaders. For example, when 9/11 happened here, there were among some groups some bigotry rising against Muslims. And the false narrative was this was caused by Muslims, so this is a form of jihad. And what good leaders did, leaders of various faiths, was come together and debunk that narrative, said absolutely not. This is not an act that represents any religious faith. The people who did that betrayed the faith they purport to represent. This is not a time for division. That's what good leaders do. That's what we need. We need good leaders that can help people make sense of this tragedy in a way that would help us have a world that is more inclusive and more sustainable, and not the opposite. But we have all kinds of leaders in this world. I think the worst thing that could happen is if small groups begin to put out narratives calling these the Chinese virus or the immigrant virus or what have you. So I'll stop now and then maybe ask the moderator to raise a few questions and then invite the other panelists, and I'll be glad to chime in. So I don't know how you want to do it, Faryal. Maybe one way is read 3 questions and then you invite people to address them.
Yes, thank you so much for your sharing your thoughts, Fernando. This was very insightful. We have a set of questions, and I'm going to read us a few questions, and perhaps it would be excellent if the panelists, we could give the panelists a few minutes each to respond to some of those questions. So one of the questions is from Winsome Gordon, who, by the way, used to be my former director at UNESCO Paris when I was there. So we are very happy to see her here. She speaks and the fact that the COVID-19 provides us an opportunity for restructuring of education systems.
You were cut for a moment and we couldn't hear the question.
Okay. The question from Winsome Gordon is that there is a undeniable opportunity for restructuring of education systems to provide equitable education. And could we explore more on the opportunities for education in this crisis? There are questions pertaining to curriculum. How do we need to redefine the curriculum? Do we need to reprioritize the curriculum? Do we need to adapt the curriculum given the current realities on the ground? So if the panelists could comment on that. There is a question about how do we move into this new normal? How do we adapt the curriculum to meet the requirements of this new normal? So this is pertaining to the curriculum issues. Then there's a question regarding to dealing with online learning from home and dealing with abusive families where the children are not safe. And sometimes the abusers are stuck at home, they cannot go to work, or they have lost their jobs. So the safety and well-being of the learners when they are having online learning at home. And then there are questions pertaining to higher education and what is the short-term and the long-term impact of the pandemic on higher education. because there's an expected enrollment decrease. There are financial constraints for higher education, and there are issues related to the labor market. So what would be the new emerging opportunities and the impact on student mobility? Because SIDS, the small island development states, have a high rate of outbound mobility, which may decrease, and what would happen to this in terms of higher education? And last is, I'll just share a question on TVET, the technical and vocational education sector. There's an idea that perhaps we should be using them to create masks, ventilators, and other adaptive responses to the needs we face at the moment. And could we be developing more applications to help schools and families? So I'll stop here. And the last question maybe I will add is, one of the suggestions is to find alternative ways to deliver education to those who do not have access to technology. So do we turn back to education as in the old days? Or should we be looking ahead and making technologies available at home to children who don't have access to technology? So I'll stop here, and panelists.
Madam Chair, I would want to.
Is there anyone who please go ahead?
And I will want to stress attempt, because the issues you raise are so many and deep. There are perhaps three main points I'd want to make. I want to begin with the question that was posed by Dr. Gordon, having to do with the curriculum. And I want to rely on Professor Reimers' 25 item checklist to provide an initial response. I think it is item 5 on the checklist, which says reprioritize curriculum goals given the reality that the mechanisms of delivery are disruptive, and define what should be learned during the period of social distancing. One of the things that I see becoming a necessity is that we need to assume that even if a vaccine is developed in the next 12 to 18 months, the period of herd immunity will take much longer. And so the vulnerability of the societies to resurgence of the virus will be quite high, necessitating, the point I want to make, necessitating a long-term defensive response. For example, classrooms in Jamaica, which typically have at the primary level, two children, sometimes 3 children to a bench that is about 4 or 5 feet long, sharing a desk of the same length. In an era of social distancing, you can't have 3 children or even 2 sitting on that desk. So you reduce a classroom that has 50, 60 students to about 20, one to each desk. So the question is, how do we cater to the other 40 students who would be displaced temporarily, or what mechanisms do we create to ensure equity in access in education to those 60 students, all of whom can't use the classroom at the same time? Seems to me that one of 2 things is going to be the inevitable response. Either we reduce a school day, for each child. So whereas school lasts for 6 hours face-to-face, it may have to be reduced to 3 hours or 2 hours, with the remaining hours being delivered online. So the question then becomes, what kinds of adjustments do we make to testing, to the frame of the curriculum, given this inevitable long-term realignment of the classroom structure and the education system? So it means that bandwidth capability, data access will have to be made far more reliable across the country, including rural areas of Jamaica, the hilly terrains where signals are weak. But more importantly, I think that given that learning takes place best in some form of community, and given that schooling is not just about acquisition of content knowledge, but the building of character, the capacity to develop conflict management skills and to learn to relate, some intermediary or perhaps some additional intervention will be necessary. And my proposal is that we would need to develop a new form of homeschooling where a trained person is assigned to 3 or 4 homes in a given day, and that person would be roving from home to home in a given community to meet the needs of those students who are displaced temporarily. Or we have these, and if we can find space sufficient for 10 students with social distancing for that person to meet. So it requires a real overhauling of the education system in that regard. And I would leave it to the curriculum experts to speak to how we would then address the testing issues given that kind of long-term disruption. The other thing about which you spoke, Madam Chair.
If you could wrap up, thank you.
Right,
yes.
right. It has to do with the question of TVET. And I spoke in the chat suggesting that our disaffection with TVET, our misunderstanding, our collective misunderstanding of the value of TVET is perhaps being exposed during this time. As I said in the chat, there are so many adaptive responses we need to be making. For example, apps. I mean, we could really have some drones dropping the learning materials in different locations. We could have bike unmanned transport systems, which is really what drones are. So the capacity to create a range of applications to treat with the problem of subnormal living conditions really create a space for TVET to come to life.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much. Yes, Dr. Tortello?
Yes, just quickly to add to what Dr. Thompson was saying, another example in the chat, there was a question about collating best practices and trying to share, and it picks up a little bit on the Enseña Chile example that Professor Reimers just shared, but a much more low-tech one at the early childhood level. We are collecting all of these and putting them on our site as best as we can in our COVID diaries and trying to share these human interest stories that give hope. So there's an example of an early childhood teacher who recognized that her school had a notice board using chalk, and she had the idea that she could get chalkboard paint and paint the entire wall of the school, the outside perimeter of the school. She got permission from the principal to do that, and every day she goes out and she writes up her lessons in chalk on the blackboards for her the different age groups. The parents come socially distanced, they take a photo with their phone, they go home, they work through it with their children. She checks in with them using WhatsApp. She also has organized sessions twice a week with her parents using Zoom if they have it, WhatsApp or phone, depending on what they have, to give them strategies to become more effective teachers, explaining to them that they've always were their children's teachers, but now more than ever, they have to be their children's teachers as parents, because the teacher who was acting as teacher and parent is no longer able to do that as effectively or efficiently as before. Nobody asked this teacher to do this. This is an example of the creativity and ingenuity and resilience that a crisis can bring. That model, that method, is now being adapted in other communities where children live close to the school and the teacher lives close to the school, and it is safe for the children and the teacher to go out at periods of the day and gather the information. So this is sort of very low tech, chalkboard. It's not hours of instruction, but it's something that's consistent, structured, and happens daily.
Thank you very much.
And low tech is good. If I could say something, low tech is good. I think that too often in education, we neglect low tech solutions because we all would love the latest technology for the kids, but the reality is that we're not there, and we have to use. So for example, one of the lowest tech technologies are books, which we had almost abandoned. This is a great time to rely on books, to build assignments where kids relate to the books, discuss the books. So there's nothing wrong with low tech. Having something that is good enough is a lot better than having nothing.
Absolutely. And as Dr. Rebecca mentioned, that 30% of learners in Jamaica don't have access to any technology. So are we going to leave them behind at this time? Dr. Alison, would you like to share your response to the comments and questions?
I do, thank you. There were many questions, but I think what I'll say is a crisis always brings out the good, the bad, and the ugly. And I wanted to draw to the attention of those that are listening what the British Virgin Islands did during Hurricane Irma. We were one of the territories that was destroyed. We had a direct hit, and what our school system had to do was move to a shift system because most of our schools were destroyed. We had students under tents, we had students in partial classrooms. We had essentially shortened days. So going back to what Dr. Thompson said, was perhaps we consider doing both. The shortened school day, not getting rid of technology because technology is needed. But I believe that at some point, we are going to have to go back to the classrooms with or without masks, because there's that social element that is really needed as it relates to students and growing. You can't grow properly and not be in that social environment while we want to maintain and keep our students safe. At the same time, I think that shortened school day with partial technology not within the classroom, but being within a smaller size classroom and moving to technology on the second part of the day. It could be second part or first part, depending, I think might be a way to go, because the world is moving forward with technology. It's not, we're not reverting. I don't say go back to the older days, which was one of the comments that was made earlier. We can't go back to the older days because technology it's there, it's inevitable. So I like the idea of the shortened day. It worked in BVI. If you look at all of our exams during that period, our students did extremely well on the CXC, CSEC, all the different exams they were able to maintain on that shortened day, and it was a shift system. So I think that's my contribution. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And for sharing the specific context of the British Virgin Islands and how the hurricane, I mean, there's a lot we can learn from the situations of the natural disaster and now the pandemic. We have our last panelist, Dr. Carol Iris Babb. Are you with us? Perhaps not. Catherine, Director, UNESCO Kingston, would you have some comments as we conclude? Catherine, do you hear us?
I'm trying to hear as much as I can because I have a lot of challenges, but I think I was lucky to get most of it.
Yes.
So I would say that the challenges ahead are enormous, of course, and that we have been able, to really be exposed to the different perspectives that were, presented here. And I'm very grateful also for the perspective of Professor Reimers. And I should say that, the Caribbean has its specificity, and we have been discussing very much in our cluster office, how really, this dimension of size, which doesn't mean necessarily that the problems are not there, how to really better support the different initiatives from member states. And I think one huge takeaway for me, it's not only different dimensions that were already discussed and that we are discussing also in UNESCO, but also how to really join forces with universities. I think the University of the West Indies and also the planning center, the Center for Educational Planning, could play a major role in this respect. And if we could all come together, it will be really, really fundamental. I think this is essential for us, and also to take advantage of the fact that the University of the West Indies also can reach out to the different member states in the Caribbean through their online platform as well. Perhaps we should be thinking how to strengthen that platform as well. And because, of course, we have the 4 campuses which have, students can go and have contact directly with the university, the dynamics and research and policies, but also reaching out to the rest of the countries would be really, very, very meaningful. And how perhaps to expand the network that we have created for the response, the educational response in the Caribbean for the COVID-19. I think now this is really important to build the bridge between policymakers, research, and really come together, ministries of education, national commissions of UNESCO for education, and UNESCO itself. We can be, just promote and really facilitate this necessary dialogue and action looking forward. And I think that's a challenge, and that's very concrete, and we can really, move forward in this direction. So I'm very grateful for this perspective, and I think there is an enormous potential in the Caribbean. We have seen it this morning in this dialogue. So, and I think there is much more. And yesterday with the teachers dialogue as well. So we can really move along. And I really want to join forces with UNICEF, and the whole UN family together with the universities, and we can really do a lot. So thank you very much, Professor Reimers, as well for bringing this to us. Right.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
I'm sure I might have 30 seconds just to respond quickly to what Mrs. Grisby said. Just to assure and emphasize that we certainly would be wanting to join forces with UNESCO and other partners in holding this webinar next month and to be seen as part of a continuation of this effort to really promote, as Professor Reimers has said, informed dialogue and therefore informed action.
Thank you so much. We welcome our collective collaboration. So thank you very much for that. Just to wrap up, just a few key messages that the pandemic has really caused greater inequalities in education, especially for those who are already disadvantaged. And this will have consequences in the long term. And if we don't have an intentional plan, as Professor Reimers' framework suggests, in the absence of an intentional plan, we will have losses to learning, which will be very hard for us to recapture. So this is really a time for us to consciously put our heads together, and UNESCO Kingston office has established a task force of COVID education specialists in the region, comprising of educational planners, chief education officers. So, and we are also encouraging countries to establish their national task forces at country level so that they can really work, because we are we cover about 20 countries in the region, but the national task force leaders are working at national level to work with other stakeholders. We really need to establish rapid feedback loops on what is working on the ground. I must mention, this is an adaptive challenge. It's not a technical fix. We need to invent as we move along. And this is going to, we'll have to be agile in our responses. And I like very much also, I echo what Dr. Rebecca has mentioned, that we don't need to reinvent the wheel again for each and every state. So we have some innovative solutions that are emerging. We can learn, and UNESCO has established a website and a platform for sharing these resources and promising practices, and we are going to continue to do so. So please do share with us your practices that you feel that we can share with other parts of the Caribbean, but also Latin America and the Caribbean, the entire region, but also with our colleagues in headquarters, so that they would know what is happening in the Caribbean and how we can learn from the Caribbean context, especially in the small island states. So we welcome your inputs in that respect. Our next seminar is going to focus on reopening schools and preparing governments to reopen schools. So please do stay tuned in with us. We are going to be in collaboration with CARICOM, we are going to be having a series of seminars coming up. I would personally like to conclude by thanking Professor Reimers for a riveting and thought-provoking presentation on a proposed framework to guide the education response to COVID-19 in these times which are really ravaging. He's presented an innovative approach that is grounded in evidence. It is timely and relevant, and we hope to participate in the survey going forward. So I would like to thank everyone. Rebecca, do you have a last comment? I see. Would you like to say something?
Oh no, I just thank you all, and we hope to stay in touch and participate more frequently in the sharing of information and ideas so that we can have a more global joined up response. UNICEF is ready to work with our colleagues at UNESCO, the university, Harvard, just anything that we can do to help minimize the learning loss that we know is going to take place.
That is so important. Thank you so much, Dr. Rebecca. So on these words, thank you, Catherine, for your leadership in enabling us to bring everyone together. And we thank you all for your participation and the distinguished panelists for their insights. We are very happy to learn that you are already advancing within your local context. So thank you very much for sharing your experiences with us. Thank you to all colleagues who helped us make this possible, and also to Peter Shapiro, who's offered us this platform from Harvard. So thank you to all. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Professor.
Thank
you, Rebecca, everybody.
Hope you stay healthy.
Be well. Thank you, Fernando. This was really fabulous. Thank you.